Hey everyone, good evening. In tonight's video, you're going to travel from the stench of medieval streets to the freezing tragedy of the Arctic, with a stop along the way for Aztec sacrifices, children in ancient Egypt, and even plagues that brought empires to a halt. Bizarre, real, and richly detailed stories that will captivate you and at the same time help you fall asleep. So go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and remember, come back every night. Your sleep deserves these stories. On an ordinary morning in the 13th century, while walking through the narrow streets of Paris, Florence, or London, the first thing to strike a traveller was not the beauty of the stone buildings, the sound of church bells, or the murmur of the markets. It was the smell, a thick, sickly, sweet, nauseating smell that clung to clothing, entered the nostrils, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. This was the middle-aged, and it stank, literally. The medieval stench wasn't just a detail of daily life. It was the invisible backdrop of existence in cities, villages, and even castles. It resulted from a tangled web of social, technological, religious, and climatic factors that together created an environment unbearably foul by modern standards. But to those who lived there, the smell was normal. It was part of the landscape. It was the world's perfume. It started in the streets. There was no organized garbage collection, much less a sewage system. Most medieval cities had no effective drainage. Houses were crammed together, with upper floors projecting over the streets, forming dark, stuffy corridors. Waste, urine, feces, food scraps, animal bones, blood, entrails was simply thrown out the windows, sometimes with a shouted warning, "Garde à l'eau," in Old French, meaning, "Watch out for the water." It wasn't water, it was anything but. These waste materials accumulated in ditches meant for drainage, but usually clogged, turning into small urban swamps. When it rained, the mud mixed with everything and flowed like a rotten river. In the heat, a fermented stench of decay would rise. In winter, the cold preserved the filth. In summer, the sun cooked it. Horses, the main mode of transportation, defecated wherever they went. It's estimated that in a mid-sized city like London in the 14th century, over 10,000 horses circulated. Each produced 7 to 15 kilograms of manure per day. No one cleaned it. It was part of the urban scenery. Inside homes, things weren't much better. Few houses had latrines. Most used chamber pots, emptied into the street or, with luck, into improvised pits. Castles had guard-robes, small holes in the walls through which waste fell into a moat. During sieges, waste would accumulate inside, causing epidemics. Some rooms had straw or dry herb carpets that were occasionally replaced, but trapped dirt, food scraps, fleas, and rat droppings. Bathing, contrary to popular belief, wasn't non-existent, but it was far from common. In the early Middle Ages, Roman traditions still inspired public baths, but from the 13th century onward, especially with the Church's growing influence, bathing became suspicious. Nudity was seen as promiscuous, hot water, a carnal temptation. Some believed bathing opened the pores to disease. Many priests taught that the soul was purified through fasting, not water. The result? Men and women went months, sometimes years or until without a full bath. At most, they washed their faces or hands with cold water. They used herb-based perfumes, aromatic vinegars, or incense to mask body odor. French nobles carried small sachets around their necks, but the smell never went away. It just blended in. Clothing didn't help either. Clothes were rarely washed. Soap was expensive and hard to make. Fabrics, often wool or coarse linen, trapped sweat, and oils. Underwear, if it existed, was worn for days on end. Many people slept in the same clothes they wore during the day. The outer layers of noble garments were passed down through generations, already steeped in odors. At fairs and markets, the chaos was overwhelming. Meats were displayed in the open, on wooden stalls swarmed by flies. Fish came from polluted rivers and spoiled quickly without refrigeration. Cheeses were stored in stuffy places. The smell of these markets was a mix of congealed blood, rancid fat, human sweat, fermenting fruit, garlic, onion, and the vendors' own bodies. Medicine was also a source of nauseating smells. Bloodletting was done at home or in makeshift apothecaries. Surgeons scraped wounds with rusty blades. Healers used concoctions of animal feces, dried blood, vinegar, mold, and aged urine to treat infections. Yes, urine. Doctors often analyzed the color, smell, and even taste of urine to diagnose illness. It was also an ingredient in lotions, poultices, and medicinal perfumes. Death, always nearby, had its own stench. Cemeteries were inside cities, often adjacent to churches. When overcrowded, bodies were buried in layers or thrown into common pits covered with lime. But epidemics like the Black Death overwhelmed burial sites. In 1348, in cities like Florence or Marseille, corpses lay in the streets for days. The smell of rotting flesh mixed with smoke, incense, and the sweat of the living was so intense that monks would faint during funeral services. Even the countryside, or theoretically cleaner, had its aromas. Human manure used as fertilizer, animal urine, smoked fish hanging from windows, pigs raised indoors. Many families shared their living space with chickens, goats, or cows, either for security or necessity. In the Middle Ages, smell was a language. A good Christian was said to smell of holiness, while heretics or the sick were identified by their odor. Leprosy, for example, was associated with a foul stench that scared even physicians. Lepers carried bells or foul-smelling rags to announce their presence. Smell meant exclusion. And yet, despite it all, no one complained, or rather, no one was surprised. The nose was trained from birth. Children grew up surrounded by strong odors and associated them with the natural world. It was the smell of life, or of survival. Modern life, with its daily showers, plumbing, soaps, and deodorants, is a luxury unimaginable in that world. The Middle Ages smelled bad not because people liked filth, but because they simply lacked the means, time, or priority to fight it. It was an era of hunger, faith, and disease, and the smell was the forgotten backdrop to it all. In 1381, the poet Jean de Vernet wrote that cities stink more than the bodies of the dead. He wasn't exaggerating. Among incense, feces, garlic, and blood, the medieval air was so dense you could almost chew it, and no one escaped it. It wasn't just the era that was dark. The air was heavy too, and sometimes it made you vomit. In the icy summer of 1845, two ships departed from the port of Greenhithe, England, amid cheers and waving flags. They were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, two vessels reinforced with iron plates, powered by sail and steam, loaded with provisions for 3 years, scientific tools, state-of-the-art navigational instruments, and 134 men on board. The mission was ambitious: to find the Northwest Passage, a sea route that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific through the frozen top of the American continent. At the helm was Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old veteran of the Royal Navy with a reputation for stubbornness. This was his 4th expedition to the Arctic. Though his health was declining and his previous mission had ended in disaster, The British Admiralty chose him for his experience, honour, and perhaps symbolic value. He was a hero, a knight of the ice. On board, everything was meticulously planned. Erebus and Terror were repurposed warships, reinforced for ice and fitted with adapted steam engines. They carried 8,000 cans of food, 2,000 books, Victorian trinkets, and even a proud piano. Officers had heated cabins, sailors wore elegant uniforms. Optimism poured from the ship logs. Franklin set sail confident that he would make history, but what followed would go down in the annals of nautical horror. The Franklin expedition, as it came to be known, vanished in the Arctic without leaving a single survivor. The ships would be missing for over a century. The crew's bodies were only found decades later, some mummified, others with broken bones and knife marks. And the clues recovered pointed to something even more disturbing: starvation, madness, cannibalism, and a slow human collapse under the weight of eternal cold. The journey started well. The ships reached Greenland, where 5 men were left behind due to illness. From there, they sailed west into the icy channels between the Canadian Arctic islands. In September 1846, both ships became trapped in ice near King William Island, and they never moved again. For 2 years, the crew waited for the thaw, but the ice held firm. Supplies began to run out. In 1848, the survivors, or about 105 men, abandoned the ships. A note left behind in a stone cairn discovered over a decade later said Franklin had died in June 1847. That the ships had been deserted and that they were attempting to march south toward the Back River, hundreds of kilometers away, a suicidal trek. Thus began the most terrifying part of the story. The local Inuit, or Eskimos, reported decades later that they had seen groups of white men wandering the glaciers, dragging boats wrapped in rags, desperate for food. They said some were too weak to walk, others had gone mad. In certain abandoned camps, human bones were found with clear signs of flesh having been cut away. Even cooking pots with human remains. It wasn't legend. Archaeology confirmed the details. In the following years, dozens of rescue expeditions were sent. Some out of duty, others in search of glory, and many at the insistence of Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, who spent her entire fortune trying to find her husband. Or at least the truth. Clues emerged slowly. A button here, a spoon there, a preserved uniform in the ice. In 1859, an expedition led by Francis Leopold McClintock discovered the now famous note and the first bodies. The tragedy was taking shape. In 1981, archaeologist Owen Beatty launched a new investigation. He excavated the bodies of 3 sailors buried on Beechy Island. Their coffins, sealed by permafrost, were intact. Their faces nearly preserved. And what was found was even more frightening. The bodies showed extremely high levels of lead. The poisoning was so severe that it would have impaired cognitive, motor, and behavioral functions. The source? The food cans, poorly sealed and leaking lead into the contents. The very provisions meant to sustain them were killing them slowly. But lead wasn't the only invisible killer. There was also the extreme cold and scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency that causes necrosis, internal bleeding, and delirium. The combination was fatal. Trapped in ice with no fresh food, poisoned by their rations and weakened by disease, the men began to die one by one. In recent years, new discoveries have helped close the loop on the curse. In 2014, after 169 years of searching, HMS Erebus was found on the seafloor near King William Island. In 2016, Terror was located nearly intact in a sheltered bay. The ships had not sunk in open sea as previously believed, but were carefully abandoned, perhaps as a last hope of return. The compartments were preserved with plates on tables and readable documents. But no one ever returned for them. The expedition that set out to conquer the Northwest Passage became the greatest disappearance of the Victorian era, a victim of arrogance, harsh climate, faulty technology, and disastrous decisions. No survivors, no final letter, only fragments in the ice, broken bones, and the memory of an empire that believed nature could be tamed. The ships have been found, but what truly happened in the final days of those men remains buried in the Arctic, along with the name Franklin. There was no rescue, no return, only snow, bones, and eternal silence. The sun rose over the Nile like a golden blade, slicing through the mist. The still waters reflected the day's first rays as the village awakened in silence. There were no children's laughs, only the sounds of adults beginning another day's labor, while the little ones were already scattered through the fields, workshops, and temples, immersed in the harsh, daily life of ancient Egypt, where childhood was not synonymous with innocence. It was, above all, about survival. Among the mud brick houses built tightly side by side, a new generation of Egyptian children was growing up, very different from the romanticized image often portrayed in films. These children faced real fears and responsibilities from their earliest years. Childhood in Egypt wasn't a protected phase, it was a rigorous training ground for adulthood, filled with obligations, punishments, and dangers invisible to modern eyes. Hori, a 6-year-old boy, would wake before the sun in a village along the delta. His father was a farmer, his mother a weaver. That morning, like all others, he helped carry water jars from the canal to the house. The amphora was larger than his thin body, but that didn't matter. To the community, Hori was already a useful member, therefore no longer to be treated like a baby. If he tripped and broke the jar, there were consequences. Not just a scolding, but physical punishment. In ancient Egypt, hitting children was an accepted, even expected practice. A proverb written on wisdom, papyri stated, "The child listens when beaten, for their ear is on their back." This was how respect, self-control, and hierarchy were believed to be taught. Schools, called houses of life, were not accessible to most. They were located within temples and reserved almost exclusively for the sons of scribes, priests, and nobles. There, boys spent hours bent over wooden boards, copying hieroglyphs with styluses, with no room for play or rest. A single writing error, no matter how small, could lead to days of punishment. A distracted scribe could jeopardize a ritual, a tax record, or a prophecy. Mistakes had no space. In the fields, the children of farmers faced even more tangible dangers. Kids under 10 herded animals under the blazing sun. Sometimes they stepped on snakes hidden in the reeds. Sometimes crocodiles climbed the canals in search of easy prey. Some children vanished without a trace, and the morning was silent. It was the natural order of things. It wasn't uncommon for girls to be promised in marriage by age 12 or 13, and to assist in childbirth even before reaching puberty. Girlhood was even more invisible. From a young age, they learned to cook, grind grain, sew, care for younger siblings, and obey. Their bodies were not their own. They were extensions of the household, of tradition, of the clan. Even wealthier families imposed austere routines on their children. Ramses II, for instance, considered one of the greatest pharaohs in history, was trained for war from the age of 5. By 14, he was leading armies. The childhood of a prince was not one of idle luxury, but of relentless discipline, religious study, military tactics, and long temple prayers. His siblings, if they failed or disobeyed palace rules, could be banished or killed. Royal blood was, above all, a currency of power. Another vivid example comes from the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the artisans who built the pharaoh's tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists found fragments of ostraca, pieces of pottery used for everyday notes, mentioning punishments dealt to children for working poorly or fleeing from their tasks. There, from a very young age, boys learned to carve stone, carry materials, and strictly obey scribes and masters. There was no escape. Disease was another constant nightmare. Child mortality was extremely high. It's estimated that nearly half of Egyptian children died before the age of 5. Diarrhea, infections, insect bites, and malnutrition quietly claimed young lives. When a child died, the funerary rites were quick and direct. Crying was restrained. Life went on. Having many children wasn't a desire, it was a statistical necessity. And then there was the invisible world. Spirits, demons, angry gods. Egyptians believed that children were especially vulnerable to evil forces. That's why magical amulets were worn around their necks, wrists, and ankles. It was common for them to sleep beneath protective drawings made with blood or breast milk. Superstition walked hand in hand with fear. Nightmares were taken seriously. A bad dream could mean the child had been marked for death. Even toys, although they existed, wooden dolls, spinning tops, small animal figures, were rare and rudimentary. Passed from sibling to sibling or improvised from broken pottery, playtime was a privilege between chores. Children invented games with stones, ran through courtyards, but always under the watchful eyes of adults. Rest time was short. Mistakes were always punished. In temples, certain children were chosen for religious roles. They could become young servants of the gods with shaved heads and controlled diets. They had to keep their bodies pure, away from meat, sex, filth, or impure thoughts. A single slip could mean expulsion or eternal damnation. These children grew up in silence, watching animal sacrifices, reciting sacred formulas they didn't fully understand, but feared forgetting. Over time, Egyptian childhood was not remembered with affection. Many texts written by adults of that era describe youth as a time of mistakes, pain, and harsh lessons. "When I was young, my skin split from my father's beatings," says a line from an Egyptian teaching. Pedagogy was built with rods, shame, and fear. Still there was tenderness. Mothers who sang softly while grinding grain. Fathers who taught their children the names of stars in the sky. Grandparents who secretly sewed straw dolls for their grandchildren. Small gestures of humanity among layers of harshness, but they were rare glimpses. Fear was the rule. In ancient Egypt, growing up was a race against time, against the gods, and against fate itself. Childhood was not a place of protection. It was a testing ground for adulthood, and few left it without scars. Hori lived until the age of 14. He drowned in the canal trying to save his younger brother. The year was 541. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, still pulsed with in Constantinople, a city of golden domes, towering columns, and streets crowded with merchants and pilgrims. Ruled by Emperor Justinian I, the capital buzzed with construction, ambition, and the promise of restoring Roman glory. The Mediterranean, painfully reconquered, seemed under control. The Theodosian walls protected the city, troops marched victorious, and the Roman world appeared to be rising from the ashes. But beneath the ornate gates, something invisible seeped through the stones and began to spread, a silent fever that within months would plunge the empire into terror. It began in Egypt. In the port of Pelusium, a warm mist carried by the Nile's winds seemed to bring more than just humidity. Ships arrived loaded with grain and rats, and with the rats came fleas, and inside the fleas the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same that 8 centuries later would devastate Europe as the infamous Black Death. But now, in the 6th century, it was a plague without a name, without explanation, and without precedent. History would later call it the Plague of Justinian. Within days, Pelusium became a ghost town. Bodies piled up on street corners. The dead lay on the riverbanks, eyes open, skin darkened by swellings that grew in armpits and groins like rotting eggs. Within weeks, Alexandria was consumed. Then Antioch, and finally Constantinople. In the imperial capital, the first victims merely seemed feverish, but soon the symptoms took on a terrifying form. Violent chills, delirium, vomiting, bleeding, and the buboes, painful, dark, pus-filled, swellings the size of apples. The disease killed within days, sometimes within hours. There was no pattern. Children collapsed in the streets. The elderly died in their sleep. The strong and the young succumbed after just 2 or 3 days of unbearable agony. Procopius of Caesarea, a historian of the time and eyewitness to the disaster, described the scene in haunting detail. He wrote that bodies accumulated in both homes and public squares, that the cries of the sick were swallowed by the silence of death, that dogs howled at night, starving, dragging corpses through alleyways. The stench of decomposition was so intense that birds fled the city. Justinian, the emperor, was not spared. Struck by the plague, he hovered between life and death for weeks. His fever was so severe that doctors prepared his body for burial, yet miraculously he survived and continued to rule. But he was no longer the same man. The plague would leave marks, physical, political, and economic, that would never be erased. The chaos was so overwhelming that the government had to improvise mass burials. Carts roamed the city collecting corpses like garbage. When cemeteries ran out of space, mass graves were dug. Then, buildings were used to stack bodies. And finally the dead were thrown into the sea, where they floated like rotting logs under the sun's glare. The disease was not confined to the capital. It spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean basin. It's estimated to have killed between 25 to 50 million people over 2 centuries of recurring outbreaks, nearly half of Europe's population at the time. And unlike the 14th century Black Death, this pandemic struck when medicine was even more primitive and the world was even more interconnected by Roman trade routes. In Italy, the plague halted the Byzantine dream of reconquest. Entire armies died without fighting. North Africa was depopulated. Cities vanished from maps. Trade collapsed. Agriculture ground to a halt. And with scarcity came famine. In some regions, there were reports of parents eating their own children. In others, survivors burned their villages in fear of spirits. Nothing made sense. Everything felt like divine punishment. During the initial outbreak, the plague followed a macabre cycle. It began in ports, crept along roads, struck dense cities, returned to the countryside, and started again. As the population was decimated, rats, the primary hosts, advanced in search of food, and fleas hungry for blood leapt to humans. It was an out-of-control ecosystem fueled by panic, ignorance and death. Religious leaders saw the plague as God's hand punishing human lust. Churches filled with the faithful who coughed together and died together. Some monks began to self-flagellate in public squares. Others preached that the end times had arrived. In contrast, a few doctors attempted to understand the evil with what little they knew. They blamed miasma, poisonous air vapors, and recommended people cover their faces with herbs and vinegar. Nothing worked. The Byzantine economy imploded. Without peasants, crops rotted. Without tax collectors, the empire grew poor. Justinian tried to compensate with more taxes, leading to revolts. The army shrank, the borders weakened, and enemies began to advance. The empire that once seemed to be reborn was now beginning to wither. Even after the first great outbreak, the plague didn't vanish. It returned every 10 to 20 years like a ghost no one could stop. By the 8th century, it was still feared in Constantinople, where bells would toll at the first sign of new cases, a grim warning that the cycle had restarted. Curiously, for centuries, this plague was forgotten. History books focused on the Black Death as humanity's great apocalypse, perhaps due to its political effects in Western Europe. But the plague of Justinian, older and equally devastating, faded from memory. Only in the 20th century, through archaeological excavations and DNA studies from medieval skeletons, was it confirmed that it was the same bacterium that haunted Europe in the 14th century. The same Yersinia pestis, the same nightmare. The plague of Justinian shaped the world in invisible ways. It weakened the Byzantine Empire, paved the way for the expansion of Islam in the following centuries, delayed Europe's urban development, and plunged the Mediterranean into a funereal silence that lasted for centuries. The plague came. It killed millions, and for a time the world stopped turning. At the end of the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire was a massive and ailing structure. Its territory still stretched for thousands of kilometers, from London to Carthage, from Lisbon to the Danube frontier. Its aqueducts still carried water, its soldiers still marched, its coins still bore the faces of emperors. But inside, everything was rotting. The economy was corroded by debt. Waves of free citizens preferred begging over enlisting. Loyalties were unstable. And the borders were increasingly pressured by the peoples the Romans called barbarians, a word for everything they couldn't control. It was in this setting that he emerged, Attila, king of the Huns. Born at an uncertain date, somewhere between the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 5th century, Attila was neither Roman, nor Greek, nor Germanic. He was a Hun, a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppes, used to living on horseback, surviving in harsh lands, and attacking like a storm of arrows and spears. His appearance shocked the Romans: sunburnt skin, narrow eyes, sparse beard, flat face. But what truly terrified them was his speed, his cruelty, and his uncanny talent for destruction. Attila grew up among warriors. He was trained in combat from childhood, but also learned Latin, diplomacy, and map reading. His uncle Rugila commanded the Huns in the mid-5th century, and when he died, Attila took the throne alongside his brother Bleda. The two shared command of the Hunnic Empire, a mobile empire, more like a marching beehive than any Roman state. But soon, Attila eliminated his brother. According to chronicles, he killed Bleda during a hunting trip. Then alone, he became the absolute ruler of a people who knew neither borders nor mercy. In the year 447, Attila launched his first great offensive against the Eastern Roman Empire. He descended like a plague through the Balkans. He burned cities, destroyed fields, killed thousands. No one was spared: women, children, priests, elders. In Thrace, the population was wiped out. In Naissus, birthplace of Constantine the Great, the massacre was so intense that bodies lay unburied for months. Emperor Theodosius II, desperate, paid the Huns a fortune in tribute to stop the attacks, gold in exchange for peace. But Attila wasn't just a bandit. He didn't want only treasure. He wanted dominion. In the following years, he turned his gaze to the Western Empire. Rome was no longer the imperial city. The capital had moved to Ravenna. But Rome was still Rome, the symbol of civilization. And Attila wanted to enter through the front gate. In 451, with an army of tens of thousands of men, Huns, Goths, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Alans, he invaded Gaul. He marched through the land, leaving devastation. Cities like Metz, Reims, and Amiens were pillaged. Paris narrowly escaped. Legend says that a young woman named Geneviève, later Saint Geneviève, convinced the townspeople not to flee and to resist. The resistance worked, but the climax came at Châlons in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. There, the Romans, led by a general named Flavius Aetius, formed an alliance with Visigoths and other groups to face Attila. It was a bloody battle. The plain turned into a swamp of blood. Aetius did not achieve a glorious victory, but he stopped Attila's advance. For the first time, the Scourge of God, as he was known, retreated. The following year, however, he returned. But this time toward Italy. In 452, he crossed the Alps and descended with fury. He destroyed Aquileia, whose ruins are still visible today. Cities like Padua, Verona, Bergamo, and Milan trembled at his approach. Romans fled in desperation. Fields were plundered, villages burned. It was as if the heavens had unleashed a living curse. But as he neared Rome, something happened. A delegation led by Pope Leo I went to meet Attila. What was said in that encounter remains unknown. There are no reliable records, but the outcome is known. Attila did not attack Rome. He retreated, perhaps due to famine, perhaps illness, perhaps fear of the reorganizing Roman forces, or perhaps, as the Church liked to claim, out of respect for the Pope. Whatever the reason, Attila returned to his base along the Danube. The next year, 453, he married a young woman named Ildiko. On their wedding night, Attila drank heavily. Intoxicated, he suffered a nosebleed or perhaps an internal hemorrhage, and choked to death in his sleep, drowned in his own blood. The most feared man on earth, who had killed thousands, died alone, without battle, without glory, from a ruptured blood vessel. His people mourned as if the world had ended. His body was secretly buried, according to legend, in a triple coffin, one of gold, one of silver, and one of iron. The slaves who dug his grave were killed immediately afterward, so no one would ever know where the king of the Huns lay. But his impact was not buried with him. The devastation Attila caused destabilized Rome's defenses irreversibly. The alliances the Western Empire had to form with other peoples to stop him turned into dependency. The Visigoths, Vandals, and other groups grew stronger. The economy was drained by the tributes paid to the Huns. Roman fields were depopulated. Imperial authority crumbled. In 476, just 23 years after Attila's death, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a barbarian chieftain. Rome had fallen. Attila didn't found a lasting empire. His sons fought among themselves and were defeated. The Hunnic Empire vanished from the map, but what he destroyed remained destroyed, and his shadow lingered for centuries in legends and fear. One man, one horse, an entire world in ruins behind him. Rome did not fall in a day, but it shook forever to the sound of Hunnic hooves. It was a hot July morning in the year 474 AD when Emperor Julius Nepos awoke in his fortified residence in the city of Salona on the shores of the Adriatic. The cicadas buzzed like the gears of time, the sea lazily lapped against the stones of the harbour, and the sun gilded the red rooftops of Dalmatia. At first glance, it was just another ordinary day for the man who, on paper, was still the legitimate emperor of the Western Roman Empire. But behind the walls of his villa, the empire he was trying to rule was already little more than a memory. Julius Nepos had been appointed emperor by Leo I, the Emperor of the East, 2 years earlier, in a desperate attempt to keep the West alive. But upon taking the throne in Ravenna, Nepos found a dying empire. The legions were in the hands of Germanic generals, the treasury was drained, imperial authority was contested even within the court itself. His rise to power, instead of restoring order, ignited a new spark of conflict. In 475, just over a year after assuming power, he was betrayed by one of his own generals, Flavius Orestes. Orestes led a revolt, forcing Nepos to flee to Dalmatia, his homeland. In his place, Orestes proclaimed his own son, an adolescent of perhaps 14, as the new emperor, Romulus Augustulus, the Little Augustus, as he was mockingly called. Rome, once feared across the world, was now ruled by a puppet child, while the true emperor lived in exile, far from Italy. But Julius Nepos did not give up. In Salona, he established an alternative court, surrounded by a few loyal followers and protected by the city's walls. He spent the following years conspiring, negotiating with Byzantium, trying to gather support to reclaim the throne. He was an emperor without a throne, without an army, but with a seal and an idea, and that still meant something in such unstable times. In 476 came the final blow. Odoacer, leader of the Heruli, deposed Romulus Augustulus, officially ending the succession of Western Roman emperors. Instead of proclaiming himself emperor, Odoacer did something shrewder. He sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor, Zeno, and asked to be recognized as King of Italy. Zeno, under pressure, accepted, but insisted that Julius Nepos was still the legitimate emperor, even if he resided across the Adriatic. Nepos thus remained a symbolic figure, recognized by the East, ignored by the West, and forgotten by history. He continued to govern Dalmatia autonomously, a Roman island surrounded by barbarian kingdoms. He commanded local troops, oversaw taxes, and wrote letters to Constantinople, still signing as August Emperor, a shadow of imperial power. Then in the summer of 480, without warning, Julius Nepos vanished. There was no war, no siege, no battle. On the night of May 9th, according to the few records available, armed men entered his residence in Salona and stabbed him to death. Some accounts say he was killed in his bed. Others claim he tried to flee and was caught in the garden. There was no public funeral, no body was ever found, no contemporary chronicle clearly reported the whereabouts of his remains. The emperor had disappeared from the face of the earth. Suspicion quickly fell on two names, Ovida and Viator, his own military officers. They were trusted men, part of Nepos's inner circle. Some believe they were unhappy with his attempts to reconcile with the Eastern Empire. Others say they acted under orders from Odoacer, who wanted to erase any trace of Roman imperial authority. There are also those who claim it was a failed internal coup, or simply a personal betrayal driven by ambition. What is certain is that after the assassination, Ovida declared himself ruler of Dalmatia, but his rule was short-lived. That same year, Odoacer invaded the region with his troops and killed Ovida in battle. Dalmatia was annexed into the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, and the last Roman fragment of the West officially vanished. Julius Nepos passed into history as the last legitimate emperor. But his death had no ceremony. There were no crowds, no coins were minted in his memory, no tomb was ever identified, his documents were lost, his name forgotten for centuries. And the strangest part, despite ruling as emperor for nearly 5 years, including his exile, no Roman chronicle details his administration. We don't know how many soldiers he had, nor his routine in Salona, nor who truly killed him. What remains is the silence that followed, a void in history, a clean cut between the end of the empire and the beginning of the Dark Ages. Archaeologists have excavated Salona for decades. They've found temples, forums, house ruins, mosaics, skeletons, but no clear sign of where Julius Nepos was buried. Perhaps in an anonymous grave, perhaps thrown into the sea. Perhaps forgotten even by those who stabbed him. The man who technically ruled Rome until the end simply disappeared. No tomb, no statue, no certainty. Only dust, rumors, and the emptiness left behind by an empire that no longer existed. February of 1692. Snow still blanketed the ground of Salem Village, a small rural community deep in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The trees, bare and twisted, swayed under winds that howled like ghosts. In the dark wooden houses, lit only by candles, tension filled the silence. A literal and symbolic darkness hung over the village. And it all began with 2 girls. 9-year-old Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, daughters of respected members of the village, began exhibiting strange behavior. Convulsions, uncontrollable screams, bodily contortions, and incoherent murmurs. Witnesses said they threw themselves to the floor, ran around rooms, and hid from invisible figures. There was no medical explanation, no rational cause. In the Puritan minds of the colonists, only one explanation was possible: witchcraft. Reverend Samuel Paris, Betty's father, was a stern man, shaped by the rigid doctrine of Puritanism. His authority was uncontested, but the village was already simmering with unrest. Land disputes, family feuds, and religious tension created a climate of fear and suspicion. When his daughter and niece began acting possessed, the Reverend did not hesitate to call a doctor. The diagnosis, common for the time, was brief and devastating: supernatural causes. From that moment, hysteria took shape. The girls were pressured by adults, by the community, by their faith, to name who had cast the spells. And they pointed fingers. The first accused were 3 women on the margins of society: Tituba, an enslaved indigenous woman from the Caribbean; Sarah Good, a beggar who roamed the roads; and Sarah Osborne, a sickly woman absent from church. All 3 had no defense. They were arrested immediately. After brutal interrogation, Tituba confessed. But her confession was calculated. Instead of denial, she claimed she had been forced to serve the devil and that other witches were at large in the village. She described dark pacts, nighttime meetings, voices from hell, and with that she expanded the scope of the hunt. Now anyone could be an accomplice, everyone could be guilty. Within weeks, other girls in the village began showing the same symptoms as Betty and Abigail. Ann Putnam Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, all girls between 11 and 20 years old, began screaming in public squares, faking fainting, claiming to see specters. The accusations multiplied like an epidemic. Neighbors accused neighbors. Children accused their own parents. Pious women, respected in church, were dragged to prison under claims that they had turned into cats, pigs, or shadows. An official court was formed in May 1692, named the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Presided over by William Stoughton, a relentless judge, the witch trials relied primarily on a highly dubious form of evidence: spectral evidence. That is, if someone claimed to see a person's spirit tormenting them in dreams or visions, that alone was considered valid testimony. The accused did not need to be physically present. Their spiritual image was enough for conviction. In June, Bridget Bishop was the first to be hanged. A tavern owner known for wearing extravagant clothes by Puritan standards, she was already viewed with suspicion. During her trial, the girls fell into trances, claiming her spectre was scratching them. Even without a confession, she was found guilty and executed. Executions took place on Gallows Hill, a rise on the outskirts of Salem. There, ropes were tied to old branches and bodies swung in the wind. In total, 19 people were hanged. One of them, Giles Corey, refused to confess. As punishment, he was slowly crushed by stones stacked on his chest, a torture used to extract confessions. His last words, according to witnesses, were, "More weight." More than 150 people were imprisoned. Many remained shackled for months in cold cells, fed on scraps. Pregnant women, children, the elderly. Even a pastor, George Burroughs, was accused and hanged for allegedly leading a witch's Sabbath. He recited the Lord's Prayer before dying, something witches were believed to be incapable of doing, yet it did not save him from the noose. Behind the accusations, hidden interests were at play. Rival families took the opportunity to eliminate enemies. Anonymous denunciations sprang from disputes over land, inheritance, envy, or revenge. The Putnam family, for example, with several girls among the accusers, directly benefited from the imprisonment of neighbors and adversaries. But things began to shift in September. When the wife of the colony's governor, Lady Phipps, was accused of witchcraft, the highest authority realized the madness had spiraled out of control. Governor William Phipps dissolved the court and banned the use of spectral evidence. A new court was established and gradually cases began to be dismissed. By 1693, the last prisoners were released, but the damage was done. The executions left deep scars in Salem, families destroyed, property seized, children orphaned, the colony's reputation tarnished. Decades later, some participants issued public apologies. In 1706, Anne Putnam confessed that her accusations had been false. Driven by pressure and manipulation, even the court later acknowledged its mistakes. The trial documents were preserved. Hundreds of pages of testimony, interrogations, and verdicts were studied in the centuries that followed. What once seemed like a simple witch hunt revealed itself as a complex portrait of collective fear, ignorance, religious repression, and a hunger for power. Today we know the girls may have suffered from psychological disorders, mass hysteria, or even poisoning by a fungus found in grains, Claviceps purpurea, which causes convulsions and hallucinations. But none of that was known at the time. And perhaps, even if it had been, it would have changed little. Between February 1692 and May 1693, Salem became the epicenter of the greatest outbreak of judicial hysteria in colonial American history. Fear of the invisible, the different, and the feminine exploded into institutionalized violence. and when the fog lifted, all that remained were anonymous graves and stained names in the church records. Abigail fled. Betty never spoke of what she saw. And Salem, at last, fell silent. The smell of blood hung in the air, thick and metallic like the smoke of hot iron. It rose from the top of the Templo Mayor and spread across all of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built upon a lake, vibrant with life, power, and fear. At the heart of that sophisticated civilization, human sacrifice wasn't an exception. It was the symbolic engine of their world, the mechanism that kept the cosmos in balance. The year was 1487 and the entire city stirred with unusual frenzy. After years of construction, the Templo Mayor had been expanded and now reached twice its previous height, with twin staircases rising side by side to the altars of two voracious gods, Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, lord of rain and thunder. The reopening of the temple would not be merely an architectural milestone, it would be an unprecedented ceremony, a blood-soaked feast for the gods. Crowds filled the streets, arriving from all corners of the empire, from distant markets and remote villages. Later estimates suggest that around 20,000 prisoners were sacrificed over 4 days of festivities, a number debated but still chilling. Spanish chronicler Diego Duran, who lived among the Mexica, recorded accounts describing an endless procession of victims ascending the stone steps as drums thundered and priestly chants mingled with cries of pain and praise. The victims, mostly war prisoners, were not led straight to death. First, they underwent a kind of ritual preparation. They were fed, adorned, treated as embodiments of the gods themselves. Their bodies were painted blue, the sacred color of sacrifice. Feathers were sewn into their hair, paper bracelets tied around their arms. In many cases, they believed they were fulfilling a divine destiny, not being punished. At the top of the temple, 4 priests firmly held the victim's arms and legs, while a 5th, armed with a blade of obsidian, sharp as glass, sliced open the chest with brutal precision. In seconds, the still beating heart was torn out and raised to the heavens, offered to the sun god. The body was often rolled down the stairs, later dismembered or thrown into the waters of the lake. For the Aztecs, human sacrifice was more than a ritual, it was a cosmic duty. They believed the sun waged a daily battle against the forces of darkness, and only human blood could keep it moving. Without it, the world would fall into chaos. Huitzilopochtli, their warrior god, was fed with torn-out hearts as divine fuel. But not all rituals involved the brutal chest-cutting scene. There were variations. In some cases, the victim was decapitated. In others, they were killed by a barrage of arrows, symbolizing the destruction of Tlacatecolotl, the spirit of darkness. In certain festivals, women were stripped and flayed alive, and their skins were worn by priests to represent the goddess reborn in flesh. A terrifying sight. Children, tragically, were not spared. During the festivals of Tlaloc, god of rain, boys and girls were sacrificed in particularly macabre ceremonies. According to records, their tears were considered omens of good harvests. The more they cried, the better. In some rituals, baby teeth were pulled beforehand to provoke weeping before the final sacrifice. Tenochtitlan did not view blood with horror. It was part of everyday life. The temples were whitewashed and stained with dried blood. The priests carried the scent of death with tangled hair, long nails and robes stained by years of rituals. They fasted for days, spent nights awake and sometimes flagellated themselves with maguey thorns, piercing their tongues and genitals in honor of the gods. The body for them was a living offering. Sacrifice was also a weapon of political power. By displaying thousands of bodies stacked on temples or impaled in plazas, Emperor Moctezuma reaffirmed his dominion over the conquered. The sacrifices were the climax of a theater of war, where the defeated enemy was turned into an offering, not just killed, but ritually absorbed. It was the ultimate humiliation. One of the most vivid accounts comes from conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who described with horror upon arriving in Tenochtitlan in 1519 an altar still dripping with blood. He and Cortez's soldiers saw towers covered in human skulls, the tzompantli, a wooden structure where pierced skulls were displayed in rows. Some sources claim more than 100,000 skulls were on display at the largest sites. Even so, the Spaniards did not arrive with the innocents many history books once claimed. They came from a Europe marked by public executions, inquisitorial burnings, and religious wars. Their clash with Aztec rituals was not moral, it was political. It was the perfect excuse to justify the massacre and destruction of an empire. The Aztecs' bloody rituals officially ended with the Spanish conquest in 1521, when Tenochtitlan was razed and Mexico City was built atop its ruins. The altars were destroyed, the priests executed or forced to convert, and the blood cult replaced with a new ritual, equally symbolic, the Catholic Mass. But in the ruins of the Templo Mayor, excavated centuries later, archaeologists still found the evidence. Human bones with precise cut marks, skull columns, traces of petrified blood between the stones. History did not forget. The heart, still warm, was lifted to the sky, and silence fell over the city. It was as if the gods had stacked all the world's knowledge under a single roof. On the shores of the Mediterranean, the city of Alexandria rose like a beacon, both literal and symbolic, of civilization. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, it would soon become the intellectual heart of the ancient world. But it was in its most coveted district, the royal quarter, that humanity's most precious treasure rested, the Library of Alexandria. Its exact size is still debated today. Some say it held up to 700,000 volumes, others 400,000. But the number mattered less than the ambition. The library's mission was both simple and absurd, to gather every written text from the known world, every language, every field of knowledge, every thought, papers, scrolls, tablets, translations. The accumulated knowledge of humanity from Egypt to the Balkans, from India to Ethiopia, from Greek philosophers to Persian poets. It was part of a larger complex, the Mausion, the sanctuary of the Muses, where scholars were housed and funded by the state. There were dormitories, gardens, debating halls, laboratories, dissection rooms, astronomical observatories. It wasn't just a place of teaching, it was a place of creation. It was where Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with astonishing precision, where Hipparchus charted the stars, where Aristophanes of Byzantium invented the concept of punctuation, where hundreds of unique works were hand-copied by tireless scribes. But the dream of concentrating all human knowledge in one place carried by its nature a looming tragedy. For anything too centralized, too powerful, inevitably attracts chaos. And so was born the question that echoes to this day: why was the Library of Alexandria burned? The answer, however, is not simple, because there was no single fire. Its destruction was slow, fragmented, and stretched over centuries. It wasn't one torch, but a process, fueled by war, fanaticism, neglect, and politics. The first blow came with Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, during his civil war against Pompey, Caesar landed in Alexandria pursuing his rival. To secure control over the harbour, he ordered his fleet to be set on fire, a common wartime tactic. The fire, however, got out of hand. It spread to the docks and reached warehouses near the port that housed book depots, extensions of the library. According to Plutarch, the blaze consumed thousands of scrolls. Whether it reached the main building remains unclear, but it was the first major blow. Decades later, the library still stood, though mutilated. Under Roman rule, Alexandria became a hotbed of tension among Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews. In 215 CE, Emperor Caracalla ordered the execution of thousands of the city's residents and dissolved part of the Mausoleum. The scholars were scattered, the halls emptied, research gave way to military control. Knowledge became suspect. Then came the deepest wound, not by fire, but by faith. By the late 4th century, Christianity, now the official religion of the Roman Empire, had begun to see ancient philosophical traditions as threats. In Alexandria, this erupted into open conflict. Christian patriarch Theophilus led the destruction of pagan temples, among them the Serapeum, a majestic religious complex that also functioned as a subsidiary library. Records are scarce, but we know the Serapeum was invaded and destroyed by Christian zealots in 391 CE. The historian Socrates Scholasticus describes the destruction of images and statues in the temple. Along with them, manuscript archives were lost. Whether the main collection had already been removed, hidden, or simply vanished over the centuries remains unknown. What is certain is that Alexandria was never the same again. It was during this time that Hypatia lived, a philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer. She was a woman ahead of her time. She led the Neoplatonic school of Alexandria and taught the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus. Revered for her intellect and hated for her influence, she was dragged through the streets of the city by a Christian mob in 415 CE, stripped, beaten with tiles, and burned in a public square. Her murder symbolized the end of Alexandria as a center of learning. From that point on, what remained of the library was already in ruins. But one last chapter was yet to unfold. In 642 CE, Muslim Arabs conquered Egypt. According to a widely repeated, though historically questionable legend, General Amr ibn al-As consulted Caliph Omar about what to do with the books still in Alexandria. The response, allegedly, if the contents of these books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they contradict it, they are heretical. Therefore, they must be destroyed. The manuscripts were then supposedly burned in public bathhouse furnaces for 6 months. It is unlikely that this story is literal. No contemporary records mention such an event. By then, there was probably no library left to burn, but the image remains powerful as a symbol of what was lost, of what fanaticism, ignorance, and war can destroy. What exactly was lost in the library of Alexandria? No one knows. Perhaps complete copies of Sophocles and Euripides, Babylonian scientific texts, Indian medical treatises, African myths, knowledge the world would never recover. Today, nothing remains of the original building, not even ruins. Only speculation about its location, perhaps beneath the Muslim quarter of modern Alexandria, or beneath the land where the new Bibliotheca Alexandrina stands today, inaugurated in 2002 as a tribute to the old one. A late gesture. A scar turned into a monument. But the question remains. Why was the Library of Alexandria burned? Because the power it held was greater than CE. The known world, at least for the peoples thriving around the Mediterranean Sea, was about to end, but not with a bang, and not with a single enemy. It was a silent collapse, cumulative, unpredictable, and total. In less than a century, peoples who had built empires disappeared, never to return. For over 400 years, Ugarit, on the coast of what is now Syria, Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, in the heart of Anatolia. Mega-regions into writing and elites who exchanged letters, literally. In Ugarit, clay tablets written in cuneiform have been found, recording messages between kings like ancient emails. In one of them, the king of Al-Ashir, possibly Cyprus, responds to a plea for help, shortly before the city was destroyed. It never reached its destination. What happened? To this day, archaeologists, historians, and climate scientists are still trying to piece together the puzzle. But all paths point to a scenario as complex as it is terrifying. Archaeological sites themselves. Around 1200 BCE, Mycenae was a Greek powerhouse home to Cyclopean fortresses, refined bronze weaponry, and a script known as Linear B. But around 1180 BCE, its cities, Ugarit, a key port city linking Egypt to the east, was also destroyed almost overnight. Excavations reveal that residents fled in haste, plates with food still on the tables, seeds stored but never used. Unfinished tablets in the clay kilns. Everything stopped, survived, though in fragments, this collapse. Force. According to inscriptions at the Temple of Medinet Habu, Ramses defeated the invaders with a mix of naval traps and land combat. But the cost was immense. Egypt never fully recovered. These sea peoples are one of the key pieces in the puzzle. They were fleeing something greater: famine, drought, earthquakes, internal strife. The collapse of centralized systems around 1200 BCE. Tree ring data Lake sediments and pollen records indicate a drastic drop in rainfall over decades. In a region dependent on seasonal agriculture, this meant scarcity, failed harvests. Food Anatolia, the Levant, and Greece are among the most seismically active on Earth. A study led by Amos Nur fled, or died, with no infrastructure, no coordination, chaos spread. And there was yet another silent villain, civilization's own dependence on fragile systems. Bronze Age cities, they had to trade. When routes were disrupted by war, piracy, or political collapse, production simply stopped. Armies couldn't forge new weapons, agricultural tools weren't replaced. The world stopped functioning. The Hittite script disappeared with its last scribes. No survivor passed on the story, no heir rebuilt the kingdom, only ruins remained. Vanished. There was demographic, technological, and social regression. Smaller, isolated villages began using iron weapons, not as innovation, but out of necessity. Bronze no longer arrived. Trade was dead. The collapse wasn't instant, nor completely uniform. All vanished. None of the old centers of power remained intact. No civilization maintained cohesion. The world that once stood of palaces and scribes turned to ash. It was not merely